Hello, this is Philosophical Rebellion. One of the craziest things I learned about how the Democrats have responded to losing the 2024 election to Donald Trump and losing both chambers of Congress to the Republican Party is their reluctance to see things clearly and their unwillingness to change. And one of the most disappointing things that the Democratic Party has done is their after-action report of the 2024 election. Because they asked questions about where they should be spending their money, what kind of ads work best, and stuff like that. But they totally neglected to ask whether or not Joe Biden should have participated in a primary in 2023. They totally neglected to ask whether Kamala Harris should have condemned Biden's genocide and appealed to the Uncommitted movement. They neglected to take the chance to have a serious look in the mirror, figure out what's wrong, and try to fix it. So I want to talk in this podcast about the main things I think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris did that facilitated the complete and total takeover of the entire American government by the Republicans. And there's actually a lot to say there because Joe Biden campaigned with Bernie Sanders and created the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force, claiming that he would be one of the most progressive presidents. And one of the first things he did to betray that entire movement was break up the rail workers' strike. We had rail workers going on strike asking for like a handful of days of paid sick leave, of which they had 0 days per year. And instead of supporting the right of workers to unionize and strike for better working conditions, Joe Biden signed legislation to take away the rights of those workers to strike. He also campaigned on climate justice. Then when Palestine, Ohio became the epicenter of a giant environmental catastrophe with a train being derailed and choosing to leak a bunch of hazardous chemicals into the surrounding area, Joe Biden's administration repeatedly lied that the environment was actually safe, while delaying help to the people who needed it. So although he did some good things, he was actually all over the place when it came to supporting labor. Same with environmental justice. He was all over the place. But there were two defining features of Joe Biden's administration that mattered more than anything else: his policy towards Israel and inflation. Inflation was never really his fault. The entire world went through a massive inflation issue after COVID. And it wasn't just that COVID shut down economies for years, and because of that, over time prices went up because production went down for a whole bunch of different goods and services. So America actually fared pretty well compared to the rest of the world when it was coming to that inflation. And on top of that, there were things like the Suez Canal got super backed up. And there were different economic issues that kept causing all of these different periods of inflation. But Joe Biden was never able to make that argument to the American people. Instead, his administration was just gaslighting everybody, saying that his economy was amazing, everything was going great, and never addressing the issue of inflation head on. Part of that was just misunderstanding people's complaints, not knowing how to make the argument that America was actually faring quite well globally when it came to inflation. But the other issue is that Joe Biden was not cognitively fit enough to be president. He was passing up interview after interview that most presidents have done. He was passing up the most softball interviews after the Super Bowl just because he couldn't do them. He wasn't cognitively fit enough, and his administration was hiding him because of it. Every single time people would see Joe Biden talk, they would have less and less confidence in him being the leader of the free world. And it got so bad that ABC had a poll in 2023 that said 2/3 of the American people did not view Joe Biden as cognitively fit enough to finish out his current term at the time. In the summer of 2023, he had the opportunity to participate in a Democratic primary. 2/3 of the American public didn't view him as cognitively fit enough to finish out his current term at the time, meaning running for another 4-year term was already out of the question. And with how little confidence the American people had that he would survive another 4-year term, It wasn't even electorally possible. So I wrote a paper, Why Biden Should Participate in a Democratic Primary. And I said Biden getting up on a debate stage with a bunch of other prominent Democrats would not only give him the opportunity to prove his cognitive fitness before going into the general election, but it would also raise up the name recognition of every other Democrat on that stage. It would get the American people and the media in America talking about the different perspectives within the Democratic Party and talking about the different leaders within the Democratic Party. So, with the American people not trusting Joe Biden's cognitive fitness and having the opportunity to support the entire Democratic Party, I asked, aside from a true lack of mental fitness, why would Joe Biden choose to miss that opportunity? I wrote Why Biden Should Participate in a Democratic Primary in the summer of 2023, when there was ample time for him to participate in a primary. And I was asking Democratic accounts like the God Pod what they thought about Joe Biden needing to participate in a Democratic primary. And I was blocked by God himself for bringing up such a heinous question. So the Democratic Party not only prevented a primary by Joe Biden refusing to participate in any Democratic primary debates, you also had Democratic influencers on social media blocking out all the people who were pushing for a Democratic primary. So instead of the Democratic Party embracing democracy and actually being willing to practice it themselves, they decided to become an anti-democratic party that refused to host a genuine primary and was trying to shut up all the people pushing for one. So the Democrats refused to allow a primary, and Joe Biden was the candidate being forced on us, even though everybody could see that he was way too old. So there were issues with messaging on the economy, and the dude who was supposed to be leading the Democratic Party was absent. They were hiding Biden. So people were judging Joe Biden less on what he was saying because there was very little to go on, and more on what he was doing. And what he was doing was bending over for Benjamin Netanyahu. Before Donald Trump, Joe Biden was the most cucked president America has ever had. Joe Biden said that Rafah was his red line. Then when Benjamin Netanyahu proceeded to flatten Rafah, Joe Biden continued sending the bombs. Joe Biden would say, stop bombing civilians. Then Netanyahu would look him dead in the eyes and bomb little children, and Biden would continue sending the bombs. Israel enacted a siege and was blocking humanitarian aid, and when Biden would tell him to let in the aid, Netanyahu would tell Biden to shut up and mind his own business, and Biden would fall in line every single time. We have never had a weaker, more submissive president than Joe Biden was to Benjamin Netanyahu, except now for Donald Trump. Benjamin Netanyahu was committing genocide when Joe Biden was in office, and Joe Biden got the nickname from his own base of Genocide Joe for his unconditional support for Israel with absolutely no red lines whatsoever. And Joe Biden's complicity in genocide was so repugnant to Democratic voters that 1 million uncommitted voters went out to the Democratic primary that Joe Biden did not participate in to cast their vote for nobody, for Uncommitted, as a message to Joe Biden that they would refuse to vote for him as long as he was engaged and complicit in Israel's genocide. So then came the debate with Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, who was clearly way too old to run for president, froze up on stage, and it was the most embarrassing, career-ending moment of any politician's life. Joe Biden had 0% chance of recovering from that debate stage freeze-up. He lied to the American people. He said he was fit enough. His administration said he was cognitively fit enough. Everybody could see through those lies for the year prior to the debate. So then when he froze up on stage, he totally lost all credibility with every single viewer. And his career as a politician was ended in an instant, or like in 15 seconds or however long he froze. So then for a few weeks, there was some debate as to whether or not Joe Biden would stay in the race knowing he would lose, or whether or not he would step aside at the last minute to try to give somebody else a chance to win. At the time, there were two possible routes that the Democrats could have gone to win the election. And I made a podcast at the time called Dropout Joe, where I advocated for the Democrats to have Bernie Sanders replace Joe Biden at the top of the Democratic ticket, keeping Kamala Harris as VP. That would have been by far the most likely way the Democrats could still control the White House. If they had done that, I bet they would still have control of at least one chamber of Congress as well. But the Never Bernie segment of the Democratic Party has been in control of the party for years, so Bernie Sanders didn't have a real shot. So the other option that the Democrats could have had to win the 2024 election was an open Democratic primary. And I wrote about that in my paper, Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton 2.0. Where I said, I believe any Democrat who comes out of a Democratic primary process, even Kamala Harris, would beat Donald Trump. But if Kamala Harris were to be anointed as the Democratic nominee with no primary, she would be guaranteed to lose to Donald Trump in the general election. So in that post, I pleaded, please allow Kamala Harris and other Democrats to participate in a robust primary, rather than forcing her to be the Democratic nominee uncontested. But Democratic leadership seemed to want to lose the election. So they forced Kamala Harris to be the nominee without any sort of Democratic primary at all. At that point, her shot of winning was very low, but she still could have won the election. Kamala Harris needed to do two things to win the election: appeal to Bernie Sanders' base and energize the Democratic Party voters, and break away from Biden when it came to unconditional support for Israel with no red lines whatsoever. Biden's career was over at the time. He would be remembered for all of history as Genocide Joe, and his own voters were swearing off of voting for him because of his complicity in genocide. So Kamala Harris would be president right now if she had condemned Israel's genocide in Gaza and said that she would no longer fund and support it, and then campaigned with Bernie Sanders on a progressive economic agenda. If Kamala Harris had done that, she would be president. Instead, she tried to move as far away from Bernie Sanders and his progressive economic agenda as possible, choosing to campaign with Liz Cheney, daughter of war criminal Dick Cheney, and lifelong Republican, whose economic agenda looks a lot more like George Bush's than Bernie Sanders. And in what seemed to be a huge FU to her own Democratic voters, she just threw up two middle fingers to the Democratic Party and told the Teamsters Union that she would win with or without them. So she campaigned alongside Liz Cheney, telling the Teamsters Union that she did not need them and she would not try to appeal to them, that she would win with or without them. And when it came to Joe Biden's genocide complicity, Kamala Harris doubled down on it. Democrats were demanding that a Palestinian speaker be allowed to speak for a few minutes at the Democratic National Convention. And Kamala Harris, her campaign, absolutely refused to allow any Palestinian voice to be heard. Not only that, when she was being asked for very reasonable concessions, saying that she would enforce human rights conditions like the Foreign Assistance Act, so when Israel was starving Gaza, America would not support it, she refused to make those concessions, making clear that she would stand with Israel 100%. So yeah, it's interesting to look at where the Democratic Party spent its money and where it would be better effective to spend it next time. But that is ignoring the bigger issue, that the Democrats shut out dissent under Joe Biden. They covered up his cognitive decline. They were complicit in genocide. They backstabbed the labor movement that got them elected. Then they went through an anti-democratic nomination process where they forced Kamala Harris on the Democratic Party, knowing that the last time she participated in politics was the 2020 primary, where she dropped out because she was on track to come in 5th in her own home state. So she had already been rejected by the Democratic Party the last time she participated in politics before she was forced on all of us as the leader of the party. and ignoring that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris made enormous political mistakes that gave us the Donald Trump administration will just act to perpetuate those same problems in the party. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have the lasting legacy of handing over the White House to Donald Trump and handing over both chambers of Congress to the Republican Party. It is their fault we are in this situation. They are to blame, and the Democrats need to learn that lesson and place that blame on them, because they genuinely deserve it. So the overall conclusion of my after-action report for the 2024 election is that Joe Biden screwed over the Democratic Party by staying as the nominee when it was clear that he was not cognitively fit enough to be president. Secondly, the Democratic Party is an anti-democratic institution that has opposed a primary process at all stages. So until the Democrats accept democracy in their own party, they should stop preaching about it. Third, Kamala Harris screwed over the Democratic Party by turning her back on Bernie Sanders and the Teamsters Union, aligning herself with Liz Cheney, and refusing to condemn Israel's genocide of Gaza.